Welcome to the Journal Editorial Report. I'm Paul Gigot. NATO leaders met this week in Wales amid growing signs that Russia's ambitions may go well beyond its annexation of the Crimea in March and its recent incursion into eastern Ukraine. Now talking openly about a new Russia. President Vladimir Putin reportedly told a European Union official that Russia could, quote, take Kiev in 2 weeks. So what's Russia's next move, and could it be against a NATO member state? Let's ask Wall Street Journal columnist and deputy editor Dan Henninger, foreign affairs columnist Bret Stephens, and editorial board member Matt Kaminsky. So, Matt, looking at where we stand right now, does it look to you as if NATO, the U.S. and Europe have essentially written off Ukraine?
Well, that's been the story for the last 6 months. The U.S. and the EU did not react forcefully to the taking of Crimea in March. And Vladimir Putin saw a green light to move forward. He has moved forward every step. We've been late in imposing hard sanctions. We've always tried to give Russia a way out, which Putin's taken as an intention to move forward. But most importantly, we've abandoned Ukraine by not helping it defend itself. Even though Ukraine's not a member of NATO, it's worked closely with NATO for years. It's been served in Afghanistan and Iraq. They deserve arms, and they haven't gotten.
What about those who say that, look, Ukraine has historically always been part of Russia's sphere of influence. It's not part of NATO. We really don't have an obligation to defend it. We're not going to go to war with Russia. What else can we do? It's going to be there for Russia to take anyway.
But we made a commitment over the last 25 years since the fall of the Soviet Union with Ukraine, both in treaties. We signed a treaty in 1994 in Budapest when Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons that we are going to not guarantee fully, but we're going to secure Ukraine's independence.
Russia was part of that.
Absolutely. They signed the treaty as well.
They've repudiated it a lock, stock, and barrel.
But we've also worked, Ukraine's been an ally, a de facto ally of the U.S. for much of its independent history, and it deserves that support.
What are the consequences, Dan, of abandoning Ukraine, as Matt talks about? I mean, strategically, as you look at the European map.
Well, I think the biggest consequence is that it will tell Putin that he does not have to stop at Ukraine. I mean, the President of the United States was in Estonia earlier this week, giving them his unqualified support.
He said an attack on Tallinn is an attack on London, New York.
There was no daylight in what he said. Having said that, I doubt that that's really what NATO intends to do. Sure, if Russian troops rolled into Tallinn, the capital of Estonia, that might be one thing. But most likely, Putin will start to destabilize the Baltics because they have ethnic Russian populations in there, the same way he did in Ukraine. If he does that, is NATO likely to act? I doubt it very much, and I suspect that is where he's going next, into the Baltics.
Do you agree with that,
Yeah,
Brett?
I do. And remember, 20 years ago, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who had been Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, warned in a very prescient essay in Foreign Affairs, Russia without Ukraine is a normal state. Russia with Ukraine becomes an empire. And that's important for us to understand. This is changing the character of the Russian state as we have known it since the end of the Cold War. It is bringing it back to something very much like what it was before. And once it's Ukraine, it doesn't need to be the Baltic states. There are lots of targets of opportunity for Vladimir Putin. Northern Kazakhstan, huge country, very empty. There's a large Russian population.
But that's not a NATO state.
No, of course not. But it means that he is going to begin piece by piece to reconstitute aspects of the old Soviet Union. And that is dangerous for the kind of order we have in the world, because it sends a signal to other countries that might want to revise the global order that they can do so as well.
Right, but NATO is crucial because as a defense alliance, it did help to unify Europe and keep Soviet Union out of Western Europe. Do you think, Matt, that one of Putin's goals here is to essentially show that NATO is a hollow promise and do what Dan and Brett suggest, which is to attempt basically destabilize one of the Baltic states, and then when we don't respond, NATO will be shown to be essentially a nullity?
Look, Putin does what Putin usually says. And Putin has said that he basically wants to divide the West, that NATO is a threat to Russia, but he thinks that he can weaken NATO, that it's really a paper tiger.
Yes. And you think he wants to do that and will do that?
I think he's clearly moving on because the ultimate reason why Putin's
moving in that direction, you mean?
Moving in that direction, but also he has to keep moving because he's to survive in power. He's beating these nationalist drums in Russia, and he needs to keep beating them to keep control in Moscow itself.
Was the NATO response this week adequate to all of this?
It was not, because they have made clear, even Ben Rhodes, National Security Advisor to the President, said we are not focusing on lethal things to send India. It's non-lethal support that they're going to send to Ukraine. The Europeans are saying the same thing. In other words, they're not going to help the Ukrainians fight to defend themselves.
But what about the response on NATO? They created this rapid response force, 4,000, about a brigade size, but no forward deployments.
No forward deployments and no real urgency about massively increasing NATO military budgets. You know, there are only 4 countries in NATO out of the 28, including the U.S., Britain, and two smaller countries that actually even meet the 2%.
I think Estonia and Poland.
Right, meet 2% per GDP of defense spending. So you have a very weak alliance and real reluctance for economic reasons on the part of all our European allies to really meet the threat that we face. You know, Russia may be a weak country in many ways, but its military is very large, very capable, and nuclear armed.
And by forward deployments, I mean moving those troops. We have close to 100,000 troops in Germany, NATO does, U.S. does, moving those to Poland or to the Baltic states where they would be a tripwire.
About 70,000.
70,000? We didn't do that.